My dead wife was standing in the children's clothing department. She was holding a small navy blue winter coat. Her fingers traced the wool collar with a gentle, absent-minded rhythm. It was the exact same way she used to trace my jaw when the Boston winters kept us trapped indoors. For 1,825 days, I had lived in an absolute, suffocating void. I had operated as a ghost in a city of shadows. I was convinced her bones were buried somewhere beneath the frozen New England earth. I had torn this city apart looking for her. I had bled men dry in windowless warehouses, demanding answers from rival crews and street-level informants. I had found nothing but silence. The grief had eventually burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, mechanical machine. I became the apex predator of the East Coast Syndicate, ruling a global logistics and real estate empire with gray, dead eyes. I felt nothing. I feared nothing. Vulnerability was a death sentence in my world, and my vulnerability had been erased the night Maeve vanished. Now, she was exactly 20 feet away from me. She was breathing. She was hiding. She was completely unaware that the monster she had fled was standing in the aisle behind her. The high-end Boston Mall hummed with the quiet murmur of wealthy shoppers and the soft sound of holiday jazz. The air smelled of expensive leather, roasted coffee, and the faint metallic scent of the impending snowstorm outside. I had only come here to buy a baptism gift for my godson. It was a meaningless errand, a brief performance of normalcy. I was flanked by Garrison and Kieran, my two elite bodyguards. They were massive, silent men who moved with the same predatory stillness that I did. They were attuned to my every breath, my every shift in posture. They felt my heart stop. Kieran shifted his weight, his hand instinctively drifting toward the heavy wool of his overcoat where his weapon rested. Garrison stepped half a pace forward, his eyes scanning the brightly lit store for a threat. There was no assassin. There was no rival hit squad. There was only a woman with auburn hair, wearing a simple gray sweater, holding a child's winter coat. I could not breathe. The air in my lungs turned to shattered glass. The polished hardwood floor beneath my expensive leather shoes felt like it was dissolving into an abyss. I took a step forward. My vision narrowed until the entire world was reduced to the curve of her neck. I took another step. The mechanical void that had protected my sanity for 5 years began to crack. The sound of my own heartbeat roared in my ears, deafening and violent. I raised my hand, a silent command to Garrison and Kieran. They stopped instantly, holding their positions by the entrance of the boutique, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle and tailored suits. I moved down the aisle, passing racks of tiny, expensive garments that meant nothing to me. I was 10 feet away. I could see the faint silver chain around her neck. It was the chain I had given her on our first anniversary. She still wore it. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the ribs. She was not dead. She had chosen to leave. She had orchestrated her own disappearance, leaving me to drown in an ocean of blood and guilt. Before the rage could fully materialize, a sound shattered the heavy silence in my mind. It was a child's voice. A little girl, no older than 5, marched out from behind a circular clothing rack. She had wild auburn curls and a fiercely confident stride. She was holding a bright red scarf, dragging it across the floor like a conquered flag. She marched directly up to Maeve and tugged on the hem of her gray sweater. Maeve turned, a soft, exhausted smile breaking across her face. It was a smile I had not seen in half a decade. It was a smile that used to belong entirely to me. Then, a second child appeared. A little boy, clutching a faded blue security blanket, his thumb resting nervously near his mouth. He bumped into his sister, looking up at Maeve with wide, sensitive eyes. He looked terrified of the loud noises echoing from the mall corridor. Maeve knelt down, dropping the navy blue coat onto a display table. She wrapped one arm around the little girl and used her other hand to gently smooth the little boy's hair. My boots felt like they were cast in lead. I could not move. I could not process the mathematics of what I was seeing. 2 children, 5 years old. The timeline aligned with the exact month she had vanished. My chest tightened until I thought my ribs would snap. Then, the third child stepped out from the shadows of the winter display. He was a boy, standing slightly apart from his siblings. He did not have the chaotic energy of the little girl or the nervous trembling of his brother. He stood perfectly still. He was unnervingly observant, his small hands tucked into the pockets of his dark jeans. He was acting as the miniature protector of his flock. He turned his head. He looked directly at me. The breath was violently ripped from my lungs. He had my eyes. They were not just similar. They were an exact, terrifying mirror. They were the gray, dead eyes of the Boston Syndicate, set into the face of an innocent 5-year-old boy. He stared at me with a quiet, piercing intensity that no child should possess. He did not look away. He did not flinch. He simply watched me, analyzing the threat I posed to his mother. I was a father. I was a father to triplets. For 5 years, I had been a father, and I had spent every single one of those days living in a mausoleum of my own making. I took the final steps. I stopped 3 feet behind Maeve. The little boy with my eyes did not warn her. He just kept staring at me, waiting to see what the monster would do. I opened my mouth, but my throat was entirely closed. I had to force the word out, scraping it against the raw edges of my vocal cords. Miva. It was barely a whisper. It was a rasp of pure, unadulterated agony, but in the quiet hum of the boutique, it sounded like a gunshot. Miva froze. Her entire body went completely rigid. The soft, maternal warmth radiating from her vanished in a fraction of a second. It was replaced by a sheer, blinding terror that I could feel radiating off her skin. She did not stand up immediately. Her first instinct was not to face me. Her first instinct was to pull the little girl and the nervous boy behind her back. She shielded them with her own body, turning herself into a human barricade. Only then did she slowly rise to her feet. She turned around. Her face was as pale as the winter snow outside. Her eyes, the warm hazel eyes that used to look at me with absolute adoration, were wide with absolute horror. She looked at me as if I were the devil himself, rising from the pavement to drag her down to hell. She took a step back, her hands gripping the shoulders of her children. "Declan," she breathed. Her voice shook so violently I could barely hear the syllables. I looked at her face. The softness of her 20s had been entirely stripped away. She looked exhausted, hypervigilant, and hardened by years of running. She looked like a woman who slept with one eye open and a bag packed by the door. 5 years, I said. My voice was dangerously low, vibrating with a suppressed rage that threatened to level the entire building. 5 years, Maeve. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. She glanced frantically toward the entrance of the store. She saw Garrison and Kieran blocking the exit. She saw the massive, tailored shoulders of the men who made people disappear for a living. She realized instantly that there was no escape. She was trapped. But instead of crumbling, a fierce, desperate fire ignited in her eyes. She lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. "Don't you touch them," she whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare look at them, Declan. They have nothing to do with you." I looked down at the 3 small faces peering out from behind her legs. The little girl glared at me, her hands on her hips. The nervous boy hid his face in his mother's sweater. The quiet boy, the one with my eyes, stepped slightly out from behind Maeve's leg, placing himself between me and his mother. His name was Callum. I did not know how I knew it, but I knew it in my bones. "They are mine," I said. It was not a question. It was a statement of absolute, undeniable fact. Maeve's grip on their shoulders tightened until her knuckles turned white. "They are mine," she hissed back. "You lost the right to claim them the day you signed their death warrant." The words hit me with the force of a freight train. The world tilted violently on its axis. The ambient noise of the mall faded into a high-pitched ringing. "What did you just say to me?" I asked. My voice was so quiet, so devoid of human emotion, that Maeve actually flinched. "Don't play games with me, Declan," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and profound disgust. "Not after what you did. Not after what you sent me." I stepped closer, invading her space, towering over her. "What did I send you, Maeve?" She looked up at me, searching my dead gray eyes for any sign of a lie. She found nothing but genuine, terrifying confusion. "We cannot do this here," she whispered, glancing down at the children. "They are listening. Please, Declan. Not in front of them." I stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. I looked at the children, my children. I nodded once. A sharp, mechanical movement. "There is a coffee shop at the end of this corridor," I said. "It is empty. We are going to walk there. You are going to sit down. You are going to tell me exactly what you are talking about." I leaned in, my lips inches from her ear. "If you try to run, Garrison will break the legs of anyone who gets in his way, and I will tear this city down to the bedrock to find you again. Do you understand me?" Maeve closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking down her pale cheek. She nodded. "I understand," she whispered. I stepped back, giving her room to breathe. "Walk," I commanded. We moved through the mall like a funeral procession. Maeve held the hands of the 2 younger children, while the boy with my eyes walked independently beside her, his gaze constantly darting toward me. Garrison and Kieran fell into step behind us, creating a moving perimeter of absolute security. The coffee shop was dimly lit and smelled of bitter espresso and burnt sugar. I signaled to Kieran. He immediately walked to the counter, handed the terrified barista a $100 bill, and silently pointed to the door. The barista grabbed his coat and fled. We had the entire space to ourselves. I pulled out a chair at a corner booth. Maeve guided the children into the booth, sliding in next to them to block them from my reach. I sat across from her. The mahogany table between us felt like a battlefield. I signaled to Garrison. He went behind the counter, retrieved 3 large chocolate pastries, and placed them silently on the table in front of the children. The little girl immediately grabbed one. The nervous boy looked at his mother for permission. Maeve gave a tiny, defeated nod. The quiet boy, Callum, did not touch his pastry. He just watched my hands. I folded my hands on the table, leaning forward into the shadows of the booth. "Speak," I said. Maeve took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked at her hands, which were trembling violently in her lap. "5 years ago," she began, her voice barely audible over the hum of the espresso machine. "I was 2 months pregnant. I hadn't told you yet. I was waiting for your birthday." A phantom knife twisted in my gut. I remembered that week. I remembered the exact suit I was wearing the night I came home to an empty house. "I went to the clinic for my first ultrasound," she continued. "I was so happy, Declan. I was so incredibly happy. I thought a baby would finally pull you out of the darkness. I thought it would make us a real family, away from the syndicate." She looked up at me, her hazel eyes swimming with unshed tears. "When I got home, there was a package on the kitchen island. It was a heavy manila envelope. I remained perfectly still. I did not interrupt. I let her words wash over me, each one a drop of acid on my exposed nerves. "I opened it," she whispered. Inside was a letter. It was typed on the heavy, cream-colored syndicate stationery, the paper you only use for official business. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. "At the bottom of the letter," she said, her voice breaking, "was your signature, your exact, flawless signature. And next to it was the red wax seal, the seal with the family crest, the ring you never take off your finger." I looked down at my right hand. The heavy gold ring with the Celtic knot and the wolf's head rested on my index finger. It was the symbol of my absolute authority. It was a ring that had been passed down through 3 generations of Boston blood. "What did the letter say, Maeve?" I asked. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to look directly into my eyes. "It was an execution order," she said. The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. "It stated that I was a liability," she continued, her voice gaining a desperate, angry strength. "It stated that my softness was a threat to the syndicate's legacy. It said that the bloodline could not be compromised by a woman who did not understand the necessary violence of our world." She paused, wiping a tear from her cheek with the back of her trembling hand, and then it ordered my immediate elimination. It ordered the elimination of the unborn children to ensure no weak heirs could ever lay claim to the empire. Silence descended on the booth. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the little girl happily chewing on her pastry, completely oblivious to the fact that her mother was recounting the order for her murder. I sat perfectly still. My mind, trained to process complex global logistics and multi-million-dollar extortion rackets, began to run the variables at a terrifying speed. The stationery, the signature, the wax seal, the timing of the clinic visit. Someone had known she was pregnant before I did. Someone had access to my private office. Someone had access to my ring. Someone had orchestrated a flawless, psychological assassination to drive my wife out of the city, ensuring she would never return. There was only one person in the entire world who possessed that level of access, that level of ruthless calculation, and that specific, venomous hatred for Maeve's gentle nature. My mother, Fiona, the matriarch of the syndicate, the woman who wore perpetual black and ruled the family's social and political connections with an iron fist. She had always despised Maeve. She had always called her weak. She had always warned me that a soft wife would eventually get me killed. The realization did not hit me like a wave. It hit me like a collapsing building. My own mother had forged an execution order to murder my unborn children and drive my wife into exile. She had watched me tear the city apart looking for Maeve. She had watched me descend into a 5-year void of absolute, suicidal grief. She had sat across from me at Sunday dinners, sipping expensive tea, knowing exactly what she had done. I slowly unclasped my hands. I placed them flat on the mahogany table. I looked at Maeve. "I did not write that letter," I said. My voice was completely devoid of inflection. It was the voice I used when I was about to order the destruction of an entire rival crew. Maeve shook her head, a bitter, exhausted laugh escaping her lips. "It had your seal, Declan. It had your signature. I took it to a forensic expert in Chicago 3 years ago. He confirmed it was your handwriting. It was a forgery," I said. "A flawless forgery, executed by someone who had access to my private vault." Maeve stared at me, searching for the lie. She wanted to believe me. I could see the desperate, agonizing hope flickering in the depths of her eyes. But 5 years of terror was too heavy a burden to drop in a single conversation. "Why should I believe you?" she whispered. "Because if I wanted you dead, Maeve, you would not have made it out of the driveway," I said. It was a brutal truth, but it was the only language she would understand. "If I had ordered your execution, I would not have sent a letter. I would have stood in front of you and looked you in the eye." She flinched, but she did not look away. She knew the monster I was. She knew I did not hide behind paperwork. "I need 3 days, I said. I leaned forward, my gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air between us crackle. "Give me 72 hours. I will bring you the proof. I will bring you the name of the person who did this. And then, I will dismantle their entire existence." Maeve looked at the children. She looked at the little boy with my eyes. Callum was still watching me. He had not eaten a single bite of his pastry. 3 days, Maeve whispered. "If you come near us before then, I will disappear again, Declan. And this time, you will never find me." "You have my word," I said. I stood up. The leather of the booth creaked under the sudden shift in weight. I looked down at the 3 children. My blood, my legacy, my reason for breathing. "What are their names?" I asked. My voice was suddenly thick, choked with a profound, agonizing sorrow. Maeve hesitated. Then, she placed her hand on the little girl's head. "Bridget," she said. She moved her hand to the nervous boy with the blanket. "Roven." Finally, she looked at the quiet boy who was staring holes into my soul. "Callum." I nodded slowly, committing the names to the deepest vault of my memory. Bridget, Roven, Callum. I turned and walked out of the coffee shop. Garrison and Kieran fell in seamlessly behind me. The moment the cold Boston air hit my face, the mechanical void shattered completely. The beast was awake. I pulled my phone from my overcoat pocket and dialed a number that was only used for absolute emergencies. It rang twice. "Speak," a gravelly voice answered. It was Sullivan, my consigliere, my shadow, a man who spoke in minimal sentences and handled the darkest logistics of the empire. "Mobilize the inner circle," I commanded, my voice echoing off the concrete walls of the parking garage. "I need every forensic accountant, every digital tracker, and every interrogator we have on the payroll." "Target?" Sullivan asked. "The clinic Maeve visited 5 years ago," I said. "I want the administrator pulled from his bed. I want his bank accounts torn apart. I want the name of the forger who perfectly replicated my signature, and I want it done quietly." "Understood," Sullivan said. "You have 48 hours, I said. "Tear the city down to the studs, Sullivan. Find the rot." I hung up the phone. I climbed into the back of the armored SUV. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing me in the dark, leather-scented interior. For the next 48 hours, the Boston underworld experienced a silent, terrifying earthquake. I did not sleep. I did not eat. I sat in the windowless basement of a syndicate warehouse, watching Sullivan work. The clinic administrator was brought in first. He was a wealthy, arrogant doctor who thought his country club memberships made him untouchable. It took Sullivan exactly 14 minutes to break him. The doctor confessed to accepting a $2 million offshore wire transfer to notify a specific encrypted number the moment Maeve's pregnancy was confirmed. We tracked the wire transfer. It bounced through 3 shell companies in the Cayman Islands before landing in a trust fund. The trust fund was registered to a maiden name, Fiona's maiden name. The paper trail was meticulous, but my mother had underestimated the sheer, terrifying reach of the empire I had built in her shadow. Next, we found the forger. His name was Nolan. He was a nervous, worn-down expert who operated out of a damp basement in South Boston. He was dragged into the warehouse at 3 a.m, shivering in his pajamas. I placed the heavy, cream-colored syndicate stationery on the metal table in front of him. I placed my gold ring next to it. "Did you forge this?" I asked. Nolan looked at the ring. He looked at my dead, gray eyes. He urinated on himself. "Yes," he sobbed, collapsing into the metal chair. "She paid me $50,000. She gave me a sample of your signature and a mold of the ring. She said it was syndicate business. She said if I ever spoke of it, she would have my hands cut off." "Who?" I asked. I needed to hear him say it. I needed the absolute, undeniable confirmation before I committed the ultimate sin of the underworld. "Your mother?" Nolan wept. "Fiona." It was Fiona. I stood up. I turned to Sullivan. "Put him in a secure location," I said. "Do not let him out of your sight." I walked out of the warehouse. The Boston sky was a bruised, heavy purple, signaling the arrival of dawn. The snow had begun to fall, dusting the gritty streets in a layer of deceptive purity. It was time. I ordered my driver to take me to the sprawling, isolated estate in the New England countryside. It was the ancestral home of the syndicate. It was where I was raised. It was where Fiona held court, surrounded by antique mahogany furniture, priceless oil paintings, and the suffocating weight of family legacy. I arrived at 8 in the morning. The massive iron gates swung open at my approach. I walked through the heavy oak front doors without knocking. Garrison and Kieran remained on the front steps, securing the perimeter. I found her in the formal dining room. She was sitting at the head of the long, polished mahogany table. She was dressed in a tailored black dress, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. She was sipping tea from a delicate porcelain cup, reading the morning financial reports. She looked up as I entered. Her expression did not change. There was no warmth. There was no maternal affection. There was only the cold, calculating assessment of a rival CEO. "Declan," she said, her voice smooth and cultured. "You are early. We do not have a council meeting scheduled until tomorrow." I walked slowly down the length of the room. My heavy boots made no sound on the thick Persian rug. I stopped at the opposite end of the table. I looked at the woman who had given me life. I looked at the woman who had murdered my soul. I reached into my overcoat pocket. I pulled out a thick manila folder. I tossed it onto the polished wood. It slid across the table, stopping exactly 1 inch from her teacup. "What is this?" she asked, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "That is the end of your reign," I said. My voice was a quiet, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate the crystal chandelier above us. Fiona slowly set her teacup down. She opened the folder. She flipped through the pages. She saw the bank records from the Cayman Islands. She saw the sworn, signed confession from the clinic administrator. She saw the photographs of Nolan, the forger, sitting in my warehouse. She saw the exact replica of the execution order she had sent to Maeve. She did not gasp. She did not deny it. She simply closed the folder, folded her hands on top of it, and looked at me with absolute, unrepentant defiance. "She was weak, Declan," Fiona said. Her voice was as cold as the winter wind rattling the massive windows. "She was a civilian. She did not understand the necessary violence of our world. She would have made you soft. She would have made you vulnerable. I did what was necessary to protect the legacy of this family. You forged my name," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "You ordered the murder of my wife. You ordered the murder of my unborn children." Fiona lifted her chin. "I secured the bloodline," she countered. "I ensured that the next generation of this syndicate would not be tainted by a mother who flinched at the sight of blood." I stared at her. I realized in that moment that she was completely devoid of human empathy. She was a machine, running on the cold logic of power and survival. She had no concept of love. She only understood control. "You are stripped," I said. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Fiona's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me? You are stripped of all syndicate power," I continued, my voice echoing in the massive room. "Your offshore accounts have already been frozen. Your board seats on the logistics companies have been vacated. Your access to the family vaults has been revoked." Fiona stood up. For the first time in my life, I saw a flicker of genuine panic in her eyes. "You cannot do this," she hissed. "I am your mother. I built the political connections that keep you out of federal prison. You need me." "I need nothing from you," I said. I took a step forward, my presence filling the room with a suffocating, predatory pressure. "You have exactly 1 hour to pack a single suitcase. My men will escort you to the private airstrip. You are being exiled to the property in Switzerland. You will live comfortably, but you will live in absolute isolation." "Declan," she warned, her voice trembling with rage. "If you try to contact any of your loyalists," I said, cutting her off. "If you try to access a single dime of syndicate money, if you ever set foot on American soil again, I will not treat you as my mother. I will treat you as a rival threat, and you know exactly what I do to rival threats." Fiona stared at me. She looked into my gray, dead eyes. She saw the monster she had created. She saw that I was completely, utterly serious. She had pushed me into the void, and now the void was swallowing her whole. She slowly lowered herself back into her chair. Her hands were shaking. The matriarch was broken. I turned my back on her. I walked out of the dining room. I walked out of the ancestral home. I did not look back. I chose my children over my blood mother. I chose the future over the toxic, rotting legacy of the past. I climbed back into the armored SUV. "Drive," I told the driver. We pulled away from the estate, leaving the heavy iron gates behind. It was late evening by the time we reached the outskirts of Boston. The snowstorm had finally hit, blanketing the city in a thick, blinding white. The tires of the heavy vehicle crunched over the fresh powder. I sat in the darkness of the back seat, watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows. For the first time in 5 years, the crushing weight in my chest felt slightly lighter. I had done it. I had found the rot. I had excised the cancer from the family. I had secured the perimeter. Tomorrow was Saturday. Tomorrow, I was going to see Maeve. Tomorrow, I was going to sit in a room with Bridget, Rowan, and Callum. I was going to look into my son's eyes and tell him that the monster was gone. I felt a strange alien sensation blooming in the center of my chest. It was a fragile, terrifying warmth. It was hope. I closed my eyes, letting the rhythmic hum of the engine soothe my exhausted mind. Then, the encrypted phone in my pocket vibrated. The sudden, violent buzz shattered the quiet peace of the vehicle. I pulled it out. It was Sullivan. I answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear. "Speak," I said. There was a heavy, unnatural pause on the other end of the line. Sullivan never paused. Sullivan operated with absolute, ruthless efficiency. A spike of pure, unadulterated adrenaline shot through my veins. "Boss," Sullivan said. His gravelly voice was tight, strained with a tension I had never heard before. "We have a catastrophic breach." I sat up straight, the fragile warmth in my chest instantly freezing into solid ice. "Report," I commanded. "It's Nolan," Sullivan said. "The forger." We were doing a deep dive on his secondary accounts to ensure Fiona didn't leave any hidden dead drops. "And?" I demanded, my grip on the phone tightening until the plastic groaned. "Fiona wasn't his only client," Sullivan said. The words dropped like anvils in the dark interior of the SUV. "Nolan has been on a secondary payroll for 4 years. He has been receiving monthly deposits from a shell company tied to the docks." My mind raced, calculating the variables, mapping the syndicate territories. The docks, the East Coast shipping lanes. "Vance," I whispered. Vance was a mid-tier syndicate boss, a rival who had been quietly building his forces, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike at my empire. "Yes," Sullivan confirmed. "Vance has owned Nolan for 4 years, which means Vance has known about the forged execution order. He has known about the triplets." The air in the SUV suddenly felt too thin to breathe. "Vance bought the secret of Maeve's location," Sullivan continued, his voice dropping to a grim, terrifying whisper. "He has been holding it as leverage, waiting for the right time to use it against you." I looked out the window at the falling snow. The city of Boston suddenly looked like a massive, sprawling graveyard. "And now?" I asked, my voice devoid of all humanity. "Now," Sullivan said. "Vance knows Maeve is back in Boston. Turn the car around," I told the driver. The heavy armored vehicle slid slightly on the fresh snow before the massive tires caught traction. We were not going back to my estate. We were not going to secure a perimeter around my own life. We were going back into the dark. The fragile, terrifying warmth that had bloomed in my chest just moments ago was instantly extinguished. It was replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. The void had returned, but this time, it was not fueled by grief. It was fueled by a predatory, suffocating rage. Vance. The name echoed in the quiet interior of the SUV like a death knell. Vance was a mid-tier syndicate boss who controlled the secondary shipping lanes out of the Boston harbor. He was a man who smiled at charity galas and ordered executions over expensive steak dinners. He had always been ambitious, but he had always been careful to stay out of my direct line of sight. Now, I understood why. He had not been hiding. He had been waiting. He had been holding a nuclear weapon in his back pocket for 4 years. "Tell Sullivan to keep Nolan breathing," I said to the empty air of the back seat. My driver nodded silently, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The drive back to the windowless warehouse in South Boston felt like an eternity. The snow was falling harder now, burying the city under a thick, suffocating blanket of white. It was a fitting weather for what I was about to do. When the heavy metal doors of the warehouse rolled open, the smell of damp concrete and stale fear hit me instantly. I walked down the dimly lit corridor, my heavy boots echoing against the walls. Garrison and Kieran flanked me, their presence a silent promise of the violence to come. Sullivan was waiting outside the interrogation room. His face was carved from granite, his eyes dark and unreadable. "He is inside," Sullivan said, his gravelly voice barely above a whisper. "He stopped crying 10 minutes ago. I think his mind finally broke." "Good," I said. I pushed open the heavy steel door. The room was freezing. A single harsh bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete floor. Nolan, the forger, was still strapped to the metal chair. He looked like a corpse that had been left out in the winter rain. His skin was a sickly, translucent gray, and his lips were tinged with blue. He did not look up when I entered. He just stared at the floor, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps. I walked slowly around the table. I stopped directly in front of him. I did not speak. I let the silence stretch, letting the sheer, terrifying weight of my presence crush whatever was left of his sanity. Finally, Nolan slowly raised his head. When he saw my dead gray eyes, a fresh wave of terror washed over his face. "I told you everything," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I told you about your mother. I told you about the money. Please. You told me what you thought would keep you alive," I said. My voice was completely devoid of inflection. It was the voice of a machine. "You omitted the secondary payroll. You omitted the 4 years of monthly deposits from a shell company tied to the harbor." Nolan's eyes widened in absolute horror. He realized in that exact second that his secret was gone. He realized that he was a dead man. "Vance," I said, letting the name drop like a stone onto the metal table. "Tell me exactly what Vance bought from you." Nolan swallowed hard, his throat bobbing convulsively. "He found out," Nolan stammered, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a desperate rush. "He found out I did a job for your mother. He had men watching my shop. They grabbed me one night. They brought me to the docks." I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the freezing metal table. "What did you give him?" I asked. "A copy," Nolan sobbed. "I kept a copy of the execution order. The one with your forged signature. I kept it as insurance, in case your mother ever tried to tie up loose ends." My jaw clenched so hard I felt a dull ache radiate up to my temples. "Vance took the copy," Nolan continued, tears streaming down his face. "He saw the date. He saw the medical clinic's name. He put the pieces together. He knew your wife was pregnant. He knew she didn't die. He knew she ran." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. The sheer, staggering magnitude of the betrayal threatened to pull me under. For 4 years, a rival boss had known that my wife was alive. For 4 years, he had known that I had children. He had watched me tear the city apart. He had watched me drown in a 5-year void of suicidal grief. And he had sat in his high-rise office, holding the secret of my bloodline as a bargaining chip. "Did Vance track her down?" I asked. My voice was so quiet it was barely audible over the hum of the overhead light. "Yes," Nolan whispered. "He hired private military contractors, off-the-books trackers. They found her in Chicago 3 years ago. Then they tracked her to Seattle. And then, back to Boston." I stood up straight. The air in the room felt toxic. "Vance knows she is at the hotel," I said. "It was not a question. He knows everything," Nolan wept. "He has a shadow portfolio on your entire family. He was just waiting for the right moment. A moment of weakness in your leadership. He was going to use them to force you to surrender the ports." I looked at Nolan. I felt absolutely nothing for him. He was a rat who had sold the lives of my children to the highest bidder. I turned my back on him and walked toward the heavy steel door. "Wait," Nolan cried out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You promised. You said if I told you the truth, you would make it quick." I stopped with my hand on the heavy iron handle. I looked back over my shoulder. "I never promised you anything," I said. I opened the door and stepped out into the dimly lit corridor. Sullivan was waiting. "Take care of it," I told him. "And then, set up a meeting. I want to sit down with Vance. Neutral territory. 2 hours." Sullivan nodded once, a sharp, efficient movement. "It will be done," he said. I walked out of the warehouse and back into the freezing Boston night. The snow was coming down in thick, heavy sheets, burying the sins of the city under a layer of pristine white. 2 hours later, I was standing in a glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor of a high-rise overlooking the harbor. It was neutral territory, owned by a silent partner who facilitated disputes between the major families. The room smelled of expensive leather, lemon polish, and the faint, metallic scent of impending violence. The massive mahogany table stretched across the center of the room like a battlefield. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the dark, churning waters of the Atlantic. Garrison and Kieran stood perfectly still by the double doors, their hands resting casually near the lapels of their tailored suits. The heavy oak doors swung open. Vance walked in. He was a man in his late 40s, wearing a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than most people made in a year. He had a thick head of silver hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was flanked by 4 of his own men. They were big, heavy-handed enforcers who looked out of place in the sterile elegance of the boardroom. Vance walked to the opposite end of the mahogany table. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and sat down, projecting an aura of absolute, relaxed confidence. He thought he held the winning hand. He thought he was about to dictate the terms of my surrender. "Declan," Vance said, his voice smooth and cultured, "it is a terrible night for a meeting. The roads are a nightmare. I hope this is important." I did not turn around immediately. I kept my eyes on the dark water of the harbor. I let the silence stretch. I let the heavy, suffocating weight of my presence fill the room, pressing down on Vance and his men until the air grew thin. Slowly, I turned away from the window. I walked to the head of the table. I did not sit down. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany, leaning forward slightly. "I am not here to negotiate, Vance," I said. My voice was a quiet, terrifying rumble. It was the voice of the apex predator, cornering its prey. Vance's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He shifted slightly in his leather chair. "I am not sure I understand," Vance said, feigning confusion. "We have a peace treaty, Declan. The harbor lines are clearly drawn. I have not crossed into your territory. You crossed into my territory 4 years ago," I said. I watched his eyes. I watched the exact moment the realization hit him. I watched the arrogant confidence drain out of his face, replaced by a sudden, sharp spike of genuine fear. "You bought a piece of paper from a forger in South Boston," I continued, my voice dropping an octave. "You bought a secret. And then, you put trackers on my wife. You put cameras on my children." Vance swallowed hard. He looked at his 4 enforcers, silently calculating the odds of making it out of the room alive. He realized the odds were 0. Garrison and Kieran had already shifted their weight, their eyes locked onto Vance's men with the cold, dead focus of executioners. "Declan, listen to me," Vance started, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "I did not create the situation. Your own mother put the hit out. I just found the pieces. I kept them safe. I kept the secret. You kept it as leverage," I said. I took a slow, deliberate step around the table. Vance's men tensed, their hands hovering near their waistbands. I did not even look at them. They were ghosts. They were already dead if they made a single sudden movement. "You thought you could use my bloodline to force me out of the ports," I said, stopping 10 feet away from Vance. "You thought you were playing a game of syndicate chess." I leaned in, my gray eyes locking onto his. "But you are not playing chess, Vance. You are standing in a cage with a monster, and you just locked the door from the inside." Vance's breathing became shallow. A bead of sweat broke out on his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the boardroom. "What do you want?" Vance asked, his voice losing all its cultured smoothness. "I want the shadow portfolio," I said. "I want every photograph, every tracking report, every piece of financial data you have collected on Maeve and the children over the last 5 years. Vance hesitated. It was the hesitation of a businessman who did not want to give up his most valuable asset. It was a fatal mistake. "If you hesitate again," I whispered, the words cutting through the air like a straight razor, "I will not just kill you. I will erase your entire existence. I will burn your warehouses to the ground. I will sink your ships in the harbor. I will hunt down every single person who shares your last name, and I will wipe your bloodline from the face of the earth." I let the threat hang in the air. It was not a bluff. It was an absolute, undeniable promise. Vance looked into my eyes. He saw the 5 years of suffocating void. He saw the terrifying, unhinged violence of a father who had just discovered his children were being hunted. He slowly reached down to the floor beside his chair. He lifted a heavy, black leather briefcase. He placed it on the mahogany table. He pushed it across the polished wood. It stopped exactly 1 inch from my hand. "It is all in there," Vance said, his voice trembling. "The original forged order, the tracking reports, the photographs, everything. There are no digital copies. I kept it entirely analog to prevent a hack." I placed my hand on the leather handle. "If I find out a single word of this has leaked," I said, "if I find out that anyone in your crew knows the names of my children, I will come back for you." I turned my back on him. I walked toward the double doors. Garrison and Kieran fell in seamlessly behind me, their eyes never leaving Vance's men until the heavy oak doors swung shut behind us. The ride back to my private estate was conducted in absolute silence. The snowstorm had intensified, turning the world outside the armored SUV into a swirling, chaotic void. I sat in the back seat, the heavy leather briefcase resting on my lap. It felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. It contained the last 5 years of my family's life, a life I had been entirely absent from. When I arrived at the estate, the massive house was dark and silent. Fiona was gone. Her loyalists had been purged. The ancestral home felt like a massive, empty tomb. I walked directly to my private study on the 2nd floor. I locked the heavy oak door behind me. I walked to the massive mahogany desk, turned on the single brass reading lamp, and set the briefcase down. I poured myself a glass of neat bourbon, but I did not drink it. I just let the heavy crystal glass sit on the desk, a silent anchor in the storm. I unlatched the briefcase. The metal clasps echoed loudly in the quiet room. I opened the lid. Inside were dozens of thick manila folders, meticulously labeled with dates and locations. Chicago, Seattle, Portland, Boston. I reached into the first folder. I pulled out a stack of glossy 8x10 surveillance photographs. The breath caught in my throat. It was Maeve. She was walking down a rainy street in Seattle, pushing a triple stroller. She looked exhausted. She looked terrified. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, scanning the crowd for the assassins she believed I had sent. I flipped to the next photograph. It was a picture of the children at a public park. They were 3 years old. Bridget was standing on top of a slide, her hands on her hips, commanding the playground. Rowan was sitting in the sandbox, clutching his faded blue security blanket, looking nervously at a stray dog. And Callum was standing near the edge of the playground, his hands in his pockets, watching the street. Even at 3 years old, he was standing guard. He was doing the job that I was supposed to be doing. I sat down heavily in the leather chair behind my desk. The psychological toll of the last 48 hours finally crashed over me like a tidal wave. I felt a sensation that I had not experienced since the night Maeve vanished. I felt fear. It was not the cold, calculating fear of a syndicate boss anticipating a rival strike. It was the raw, paralyzing, agonizing fear of a father. My children were out there. They were sleeping in a hotel room in downtown Boston, surrounded by my men, but they were still exposed. They were still vulnerable to the poison of my world. I spent the next 4 hours reading every single page in the briefcase. I memorized their routines. I memorized the names of the pediatricians Maeve had used under assumed names. I memorized the exact layout of the hotel floor where they were currently sleeping. I was building a fortress in my mind, calculating every possible angle of attack, every possible vulnerability. The grandfather clock in the corner of the study chimed softly. It was 2:47 in the morning. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing red embers. The silence of the estate was absolute. Then, the encrypted phone on my desk vibrated. The sudden, violent buzz shattered the quiet peace of the study. I stared at the phone for a fraction of a second. Sullivan never called at this hour unless the perimeter had been breached. I picked up the device and pressed it to my ear. "Speak," I said. My voice was a harsh, gravelly rasp. "Boss," Sullivan said. His voice was tight. It was strained with a tension that made the blood freeze in my veins. "We have a catastrophic situation." I sat up straight, the leather chair creaking loudly in the quiet room. "Report," I commanded. "I was running a secondary audit on the financial documents we extracted from Vance's briefcase," Sullivan said, his words coming fast and sharp. Vance was meticulous. He documented every single person who had access to the secret. "And," I demanded, my grip on the phone tightening until my knuckles turned white. "There is a discrepancy," Sullivan said. "Vance didn't just buy the secret from Nolan. He bought a contingency plan from someone inside our own house." The air in the study suddenly felt too thin to breathe. "Who?" I asked. "Harrison," Sullivan said. The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Harrison. He was a high-powered defense attorney. He was Fiona's most loyal fixer. He was the man who handled the legal architecture of the syndicate, burying our sins under mountains of corporate paperwork. "Explain," I ordered, my voice dropping to a terrifying dead whisper. "Harrison set up a dead man's switch," Sullivan explained, the grim reality of the situation bleeding into his tone. "Fiona knew that if you ever found out the truth, you would exile her. She instructed Harrison to activate a protocol the moment she was removed from power." "What protocol?" I asked, though the cold, sickening dread in my stomach already knew the answer. "Harrison sold the intel," Sullivan said. "He didn't sell it to Vance. Vance is too cautious. Harrison sold Maeve's exact location to the highest, most aggressive bidder on the board." I stood up from the desk, the glossy photographs of my children scattered across the mahogany surface. "O'Shea," I whispered. "Yes," Sullivan confirmed. O'Shea was a rogue capo. He was an ambitious, violent underboss who controlled the Northern Territories. He had been chafing under my disciplined, corporate rule for years. He wanted a return to the old days of loud violence and street-level terror. He wanted the throne. "O'Shea bought the intel 3 hours ago," Sullivan continued, his voice dropping to a grim, terrifying whisper. "He knows about the triplets. He knows that if he wipes out your bloodline, the council will view you as weak and broken. He is making a play for the entire empire." I looked out the window at the falling snow. The city of Boston suddenly looked like a massive, sprawling graveyard. "Where's O'Shea's crew?" I asked, my voice devoid of all humanity. "They are mobilizing," Sullivan said. "Our spotters at the northern docks report 3 heavily armed SUVs leaving O'Shea's compound 10 minutes ago. They are heading south, toward the city center, toward the hotel, toward Maeve, toward Bridget, Rowan, and Callum." The void inside me shattered completely. It was replaced by a blinding, apocalyptic violence. "0 hour," I commanded. My voice echoed off the walls of the study, a terrifying roar of absolute authority. "Initiate a 0-hour evacuation of the hotel. Move Maeve and the children immediately." "Where to?" Sullivan asked, the sound of keyboards clacking frantically in the background. "The Blacksite property in Fairfield," I said. It was a heavily fortified safe house hidden deep in the Connecticut woods, entirely off the syndicate books. "I want Garrison and Kieran leading the extraction. I want a 10-car decoy convoy heading west to draw O'Shea's spotters, and I want the Fairfield property locked down with a 20-man perimeter." "Understood," Sullivan said. "I am leaving the estate now," I said. "I will meet them at Fairfield. If a single one of O'Shea's men gets within a mile of my family, I will hold you personally responsible, Sullivan." "They won't," Sullivan promised. I hung up the phone. I did not bother to grab a coat. I walked out of the study, down the grand staircase, and out into the freezing blizzard. My driver was already waiting, the engine of the armored SUV roaring in the quiet night. "Fairfield," I told him as I climbed into the back seat. "Do not stop for anything." The drive across the state line was a blur of blinding snow and agonizing tension. I sat in the darkness, checking the heavy, matte black pistol holstered at my waist. I checked the spare magazines. I was no longer a CEO managing a logistics empire. I was a father going to war. We arrived at the Fairfield Blacksite just as the first light of dawn began to turn the eastern sky a bruised, heavy purple. The property was a massive, brutalist concrete structure hidden behind high iron gates and dense pine trees. It was designed to withstand a siege. As my SUV pulled into the hidden courtyard, I saw Garrison and Kieran's vehicles already parked near the entrance. The heavy steel doors of the safe house were open. I stepped out of the car into the biting cold. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and impending violence. I walked quickly toward the entrance. Just as I reached the steps, Maeve was pulled from the back of Garrison's SUV. She was wearing a heavy winter coat over her pajamas. Her auburn hair was wild and tangled from sleep. She was holding Bridget tightly against her chest. The little girl was groggy and confused, burying her face in her mother's neck. Kieran was carrying Rowan. The nervous boy was crying softly, his small hands clutching his faded blue security blanket with a desperate grip. And then I saw Callum. He was walking on his own, right beside Garrison. He was wearing a dark winter jacket, his small hands tucked into his pockets. He was not crying. He was not hiding. He stopped at the bottom of the concrete steps. He looked up. He saw me standing there in the freezing wind, my overcoat billowing around my legs, the heavy pistol visible at my waist. He looked at the weapon. Then, he looked up into my gray, dead eyes. He did not look away. He was analyzing the situation. He was trying to determine if the monster who had suddenly appeared in his life was the cause of this terror or the shield against it. I walked down the steps. I stopped 3 feet away from Maeve. She looked at me, her hazel eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated panic. "What is happening, Declan?" she demanded, her voice shaking violently. "Why did your men pull us out of bed? Why are we here?" I looked at the children. I looked at the terrified faces of my bloodline. "The perimeter at the hotel was compromised," I said. My voice was low, steady, and completely devoid of panic. I needed to be the anchor in her storm. "A rival faction bought the intel of your location. They mobilized a hit squad." Maeve let out a choked, agonizing sob. She pulled Bridget closer, her entire body trembling. "You promised me 3 days." She wept. "You promised me we would be safe." "You are safe," I said. I took a half step closer, invading her space, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "This property does not exist on any syndicate ledger. The walls are reinforced concrete. The windows are ballistic glass. You have 20 of my most elite men standing guard outside." I reached out slowly. I did not touch her, but I held my hand near her shoulder, a silent vow of protection. "I am going to leave," I said. "I am going to find the man who sold your location. And then, I am going to find the man who bought it. I will dismantle the threat before the sun fully rises." Maeve stared at me. She saw the absolute, terrifying violence radiating from my pores. She saw the monster she had fled 5 years ago. But for the first time, she realized that the monster was fighting for her. "Do not let them near my children," she whispered fiercely. "I will burn the city to the ground first," I promised. I turned to Garrison. "Get them inside," I ordered. "Lock down the interior safe room. No one goes in or out until I return." Garrison nodded. He guided Maeve and the children up the concrete steps and into the heavy steel fortress. Callum was the last to enter. He stopped at the threshold. He looked back over his shoulder at me. He gave me a single, slow nod. It was the nod of a soldier acknowledging his commander. Then, the heavy steel doors slammed shut, sealing my family inside the vault. I turned back to my armored SUV. "Where to, boss?" my driver asked, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "The waterfront," I said. "Find Harrison." The hunt for Fiona's loyalist lawyer did not take long. Harrison was a man who lived in expensive penthouses and drank $1,000 wine. He was not built for life on the run. Sullivan's digital trackers located his burner phone pinging off a cell tower near the industrial docks in North Boston. It was a desolate, rotting stretch of the waterfront, filled with abandoned warehouses and cheap, hourly motels. We arrived at the motel just as the gray light of morning began to filter through the heavy snow clouds. The building was a dilapidated 2-story structure with peeling paint and flickering neon signs. The smell of rotting seaweed, cheap whiskey, and despair hung heavy in the freezing air. I stepped out of the SUV. I did not bring Garrison or Kieran. They were at Fairfield, guarding the only thing in the world that mattered. I walked alone across the icy parking lot. I found room number 12 on the ground floor. The curtains were drawn tight. I did not knock. I raised my heavy boot and kicked the cheap wooden door with the force of a battering ram. The door splintered around the deadbolt and crashed inward, hanging off its hinges. I stepped into the room. It was dark, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and fear. Harrison was scrambling backward across the stained carpet, trying to reach a small silver revolver resting on the nightstand. He was wearing a wrinkled suit, his tie undone, his hair wild and greasy. He looked pathetic. I crossed the room in 2 massive strides. Before his fingers could even brush the handle of the gun, I grabbed him by the throat. I lifted him off the floor and slammed him against the cheap wood-paneled wall. The impact knocked the breath out of his lungs in a violent wheeze. "Declan," Harrison gasped, his eyes bulging in terror. His hands clawed desperately at my leather-gloved grip, but it was like trying to pry open a steel vise. "You activated the switch," I said. My voice was a terrifying, dead whisper that filled the small room. "You sold my family to O'Shea. Fiona ordered it." Harrison choked out, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. "She said if she went down, the bloodline had to be erased. She said it was the only way to protect the legacy." I tightened my grip. Harrison's eyes rolled back slightly as the oxygen to his brain was cut off. "How much did O'Shea pay you?" I asked. $5 million, Harrison wheezed. "Wired to an offshore account." "Please, Declan." I was just following the matriarch's orders. I leaned in close. I let him see the absolute, bottomless void in my eyes. "You sold the hotel address," I said, "but O'Shea's men did not hit the hotel. My spotters reported them moving south, but they never arrived at the city center." A sudden, sickening realization began to form in the back of my mind. I looked at Harrison's terrified, sweating face. I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. It was not just fear. It was guilt. It was the guilt of a man who had sold a much larger secret than he was admitting. "What else did you sell him, Harrison?" I demanded, my voice dropping to a demonic growl. Harrison squeezed his eyes shut. Tears leaked out from the corners. "I am the syndicate lawyer, Declan," he sobbed. "I hold the deeds to all the properties, even the ones off the books." The air in the cheap motel room suddenly turned to ice. My heart stopped beating. "What did you sell him?" I roared, slamming him against the wall again. "I sold him the contingency plans." Harrison wept, his voice breaking into a pathetic wail. "I sold him the blueprints to the black sites. I sold him the Fairfield address." The world tilted violently on its axis. The ambient noise of the ocean hitting the pylons outside faded into a high-pitched ringing. O'Shea was not going to the hotel. He had never intended to go to the hotel. He knew standard syndicate protocol. He knew that the moment his mobilization was spotted, I would evacuate my family to the most secure location on the board. He had bought the Fairfield address. He had let me move them exactly where he wanted them. He had let me lock my wife and children inside a concrete vault. And now, his hit squad was descending on it. I dropped Harrison. He collapsed onto the stained carpet, gasping for air, coughing violently. I did not waste a single bullet on him. He was already a ghost. I turned and sprinted out of the motel room. I hit the icy parking lot running, pulling the encrypted phone from my overcoat pocket. I dialed Sullivan's number. My thumb hovered over the screen, my hand shaking with a terror I had never known existed. The phone rang once. It rang twice. Sullivan. I barked the moment the line connected. The Fairfield site is compromised. O'Shea has the address. He has the blueprints. Move them now. Get them out of the vault. There was a heavy, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. Sullivan, I roared, throwing open the door of the armored SUV. Do you copy? Move them now. Then, I heard it. It was not Sullivan's voice. It was the sound of the encrypted line picking up background audio from the Fairfield command center. I heard Maeve's voice, screaming my name in absolute, unadulterated terror. I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of automatic weapons fire echoing off concrete walls. And then, I heard the chilling, unmistakable sound of ballistic glass shattering into a million pieces. Sullivan, I roared, throwing open the door of the armored SUV. Do you copy? Move them now. Then, I heard it. It was not Sullivan's voice. It was the sound of the encrypted line picking up background audio from the Fairfield command center. I heard Maeve's voice, screaming my name in absolute, unadulterated terror. I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of automatic weapons fire echoing off concrete walls. And then, I heard the chilling, unmistakable sound of ballistic glass shattering into a million pieces. The line went completely dead. The silence that filled the freezing motel parking lot was heavier than the ocean. I threw the encrypted phone onto the passenger seat. I slammed the heavy gear shift into drive. The massive armored vehicle tore out of the lot, the tires spinning wildly on the black ice before they finally caught traction. I did not care about the blinding blizzard. I did not care about the treacherous, winding roads of the New England coastline. I pushed the engine to its absolute terrifying limit. The speedometer climbed past 100 miles an hour. The world outside the reinforced windshield was a chaotic blur of white snow and darkness. But inside my mind, there was only a cold, hyper-focused clarity. O'Shea's men were inside the perimeter. They were inside the walls of the safe house. They were breathing the exact same air as my children. The drive to the Fairfield Black site took exactly 14 minutes. It felt like 14 lifetimes. When I reached the hidden access road, I killed the headlights. I navigated the final mile in absolute darkness, relying entirely on my memory of the terrain. The heavy iron gates of the property had been blown completely off their hinges. The twisted, blackened metal lay half buried in the fresh snow. 3 of O'Shea's black tactical vehicles were parked haphazardly in the courtyard, their doors hanging wide open. The bodies of 4 of my perimeter guards lay motionless on the frozen ground. I stopped the SUV. I drew my heavy, matte black pistol from its shoulder holster. I checked the chamber. I stepped out into the biting winter wind. The air was thick with the acrid, metallic smell of cordite and burning rubber. I moved toward the shattered entrance of the concrete safe house with the terrifying stillness of a ghost. I was no longer a syndicate boss. I was a father, and I was bringing hell to anyone who stood between me and my bloodline. The interior of the safe house was a war zone. The reinforced steel front doors had been breached with thermal charges. The main hallway was filled with thick, gray smoke that stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat. I heard the sharp, staccato bursts of suppressed gunfire coming from the west wing. That was where the interior safe room was located. That was where Garrison and Kieran were making their final stand. I moved down the corridor, my heavy boots making absolutely no sound on the concrete floor. I rounded the corner. 2 of O'Shea's mercenaries were stacking up outside the heavy steel door of the vault. They were wearing full tactical gear and black balaclavas. One of them was preparing to plant a heavy breaching charge directly on the deadbolt. I did not hesitate. I did not issue a warning. I raised my weapon and put 2 rounds directly into the back of the first man's skull. He dropped instantly, his body hitting the floor with a heavy, lifeless thud. The second man spun around, raising his automatic rifle. I fired again, hitting him twice in the center of his chest. He stumbled backward, his ceramic armor absorbing the impact, but the kinetic force knocked him off balance. Before he could recover his footing, I closed the distance. I drove the barrel of my pistol under his chin and pulled the trigger. The hallway fell completely silent. I stepped over the bodies. I slammed my bloody fist against the heavy steel door of the vault. "Garrison," I roared, my voice echoing through the smoke-filled corridor. "It is Declan. Open the door." There was a tense, agonizing pause. Then, the heavy internal deadbolts disengaged with a loud, metallic clack. The door swung open a fraction of an inch. Garrison's face appeared in the narrow gap. His eyes were wild, and his face was covered in concrete dust and a spray of blood that was not his own. He saw me and immediately pulled the heavy door wide open. I stepped inside. The room was a windowless 10 by 10 concrete box, illuminated only by a harsh red emergency light. Maeve was huddled in the far corner. She had her arms wrapped entirely around the 3 children, shielding them with her own body. She was shaking so violently her teeth were chattering. I knelt down on the cold floor in front of her. I placed my hands firmly on her shoulders. "Maeve," I said. My voice was low, steady, and completely devoid of the apocalyptic violence I had just committed. "Look at me." She slowly raised her head. Her hazel eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. "They are inside the house," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know," I said. "I'm going to clear the rest of the property. Garrison and Kieran are going to hold this exact corridor." I reached out and gently touched the side of her face. "I need you to lock this door. You do not open it for anyone, not even if you hear my voice." Maeve swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically to the heavy steel door. "How will I know it is safe?" she asked. "I am going to teach you a code," I said. 3 slow knocks, a pause, and then 2 fast knocks. I demonstrated the exact rhythm on the concrete floor with my knuckles. 3 slow, 2 fast. "Do you understand me?" Maeve nodded, pulling the children even tighter against her chest. 3 slow, 2 fast, she repeated, her voice trembling. "Lock it," I commanded. I stood up and stepped back out into the smoke-filled hallway. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind me. I heard the massive deadbolt slide back into place, sealing my family inside the vault. I turned to Garrison and Kieran. "Hold this position," I ordered. "If anyone comes down this hallway who is not me, you put them in the ground." They nodded silently, raising their weapons and taking up defensive postures behind the concrete pillars. I moved deeper into the safe house. The architectural layout was permanently burned into my memory. I cleared the living room. I cleared the study. I moved toward the massive industrial kitchen at the back of the house. The room was dark, illuminated only by the pale moonlight reflecting off the stainless steel appliances. I stepped through the doorway. I did not see him until it was too late. The assassin had been waiting in the blind spot behind the massive commercial refrigerator. He lunged at me with terrifying speed. He did not have a gun. He had a heavy, serrated combat knife. He swung the blade in a vicious, upward arc, aiming directly for my throat. I reacted on pure, ingrained instinct. I dropped my pistol and caught his wrist with my left hand, stopping the serrated edge mere inches from my jugular. The sheer momentum of his charge slammed us both into the heavy marble island in the center of the kitchen. The impact knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. He was massive, easily outweighing me by 50 pounds, and he was fueled by adrenaline. He drove his knee brutally into my stomach, trying to break my grip on his wrist. I twisted my body, using his own forward weight against him, and slammed his arm against the sharp edge of the marble counter. The knife clattered loudly to the ceramic tile floor, but the assassin did not stop. He spun around and drove a vicious, crushing elbow directly into my ribs. I heard the sickening, unmistakable crack of bone. A blinding flash of pure agony shot through my torso, stealing the air from my lungs. I stumbled backward, gasping for breath. He followed up immediately with a brutal right hook that caught me flush on the jaw. The world spun violently. The warm, metallic taste of copper flooded my mouth. I hit the floor hard, my vision blurring at the edges. The assassin stood over me, his chest heaving in the dark. He reached down to his tactical boot and pulled a secondary, smaller blade. He raised it high above his head, preparing to drive it straight through my chest. I did not panic. I did not feel fear. I felt the cold, absolute certainty of the void that had kept me alive for 5 years. As he brought the knife down, I rolled violently to the right. The blade sparked against the ceramic tile floor, missing my ribs by a fraction of an inch. I swept my leg out, catching him hard behind the knees. He crashed down beside me with a heavy grunt. Before he could recover his balance, I was on top of him. I ignored the agonizing, screaming pain in my shattered ribs. I ignored the blood pouring from my split lip and running down my chin. I wrapped my bare hands around his throat. I squeezed. He thrashed wildly beneath me, his hands clawing desperately at my face, trying to gouge my eyes. I tucked my chin down and tightened my grip. I poured every single ounce of my 5-year grief into my hands. I poured every ounce of my suffocating rage, every sleepless night, every moment of absolute despair into my grip. I squeezed until his frantic thrashing began to slow. I squeezed until his eyes rolled back in his head. I squeezed until I felt the cartilage in his throat collapse under the sheer, terrifying force of my will. He went completely limp. I let go. I collapsed onto the cold tile floor next to him, my chest heaving, my broken ribs screaming in agony with every breath. I lay there in the dark for a long time, I listened to the absolute silence of the house. The breach was over. The threat was eliminated. I slowly pushed myself up off the floor. Every single movement was a masterclass in pain. I retrieved my pistol from the shadows near the refrigerator. I walked heavily back through the smoke-filled corridors, leaving a trail of blood drops on the concrete. Garrison and Kieran were still standing guard outside the vault. They lowered their weapons the moment they saw me emerge from the smoke. I walked up to the heavy steel door. I raised my bloody, bruised fist. I knocked 3 times, slowly. I paused, fighting through the pain in my chest. I knocked twice. Fast. The silence on the other side of the door was agonizing. Then, I heard the heavy deadbolts slide back one by one. The door opened. Maeve stood in the doorway. She looked at me. She saw the dark blood dripping from my jaw onto my ruined shirt. She saw the rigid way I was favoring my right side, holding my arm tight against my cracked ribs to keep them from shifting. She saw the absolute, terrifying violence that I had just committed to keep her safe. She stepped aside. I walked into the small concrete room. The children were sitting on the floor, huddled together under a heavy gray wool blanket. Bridget looked up at me. Her wild auburn curls were a tangled mess. She pointed a small, trembling finger at my face. "You are bleeding," she said. Her voice was surprisingly steady for a 5-year-old who had just survived a siege. "I am," I said, my voice a raspy, exhausted whisper. "But I am okay." Rowan peeked out from under the edge of the blanket. He was clutching his faded blue security blanket so tightly his small knuckles were completely white. He looked at my torn overcoat, and the heavy pistol still gripped loosely in my hand. "Did the bad men go away?" he asked, his voice trembling with unshed tears. "Yes," I said, looking directly into his sensitive eyes. "They are gone. They will never come back. I promise you." Then, Callum stood up. He dropped his corner of the blanket. He walked slowly over to me. He did not look at the blood on my face. He did not look at the weapon in my hand. He looked directly into my gray, dead eyes. "Were you the one making sure we were safe?" he asked. The question hung in the heavy, stale air of the concrete vault. It was not just a question about the men who had attacked the house tonight. It was a question about who I was. It was a question about whether I was the monster hiding in the dark, or the shield standing against it. I slowly lowered myself to the floor. The pain in my ribs was excruciating, a sharp, stabbing fire that took my breath away, but I ignored it. I sat cross-legged on the cold concrete, bringing myself down to his exact eye level. "Yes," I said. "I was the one making sure you were safe." Callum stared at me for a long, silent moment. He was analyzing my answer with that unnerving, quiet perception. He was searching my face for the lie. He found nothing but absolute, undeniable truth. He gave me a single, slow nod. He accepted me. He turned around, walked back to his siblings, and sat down beside them on the floor. I looked up at Maeve. She was leaning against the concrete wall, tears streaming silently down her pale face. She was looking at me with a mixture of profound exhaustion and a fragile, terrifying hope. I had finally broken the 5-year void. I was bleeding. I was broken. But I was alive, and I was looking at my family. "I am staying," I told her. My voice was quiet, but it carried the heavy weight of an absolute, unbreakable vow. "I am not leaving you again. I am staying." Maeve closed her eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. She slowly slid down the concrete wall until she was sitting on the floor right next to me. She did not say anything. She just reached out and rested her hand gently against my uninjured side. It was the first time she had willingly touched me in 5 years. It felt like coming home. 3 days later, the violent storm had finally passed, leaving the city of Boston buried under a thick layer of frozen, dirty snow. I stood at the head of the massive mahogany table in the syndicate boardroom. My ribs were tightly wrapped in heavy medical bandages beneath my tailored black suit. The left side of my jaw was a deep, mottled purple, a visible testament to the violence of the safe house. I looked like a man who had walked through hell and slaughtered the devil himself. The 12 remaining capos of the East Coast Syndicate sat around the table. They were completely silent. They were terrified. They had all heard the whispers of what happened at the Fairfield Black site. They knew that O'Shea and his entire elite hit squad had been systematically dismantled in under 20 minutes. I placed my hands flat on the polished wood. I looked at each man, letting my dead gray eyes bore into their souls. "O'Shea is dead," I said. My voice was a quiet, resonant rumble that commanded absolute, unquestionable authority. "His lieutenants are dead. His financial assets have been seized and redistributed to the central vault." No one spoke. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. "Harrison has been exiled," I continued, pacing slowly behind my chair. "He has been stripped of his law license, his properties, and his syndicate protection. If any of you ever speak his name again, you will join him. I stood up straight, letting the suffocating weight of my presence crush the air out of the room. The old guard is dissolved, I announced. The era of quiet manipulation, forged letters, and internal politics is over. From this exact moment forward, there is only one rule. I leaned forward, resting my knuckles on the table. Absolute loyalty to my bloodline. If anyone questions my authority, if anyone looks at my family with anything other than absolute respect, I will not call a council meeting. I let the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds. I will simply erase you. I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of every single capo. Are we clear? 12 men nodded in perfect, terrified unison. The purge was complete. I had established a terrifying absolute dominance over the empire. I turned and walked out of the boardroom without another word. There was one last piece of business to attend to. I took the private syndicate jet across the Atlantic. I landed in Geneva just as the sun was setting over the jagged, snow-capped Alps. A black car drove me up the winding, treacherous mountain roads to the isolated, sprawling estate where Fiona had been exiled. The house was a masterpiece of cold, sterile Swiss architecture. It was beautiful, and it was completely devoid of life. I found her sitting in the grand conservatory, looking out at the frozen landscape through floor-to-ceiling windows. She was wearing her perpetual black dress. She looked 10 years older. The arrogant, calculating matriarch who had ruled the Boston underworld had been replaced by a hollow, isolated woman. She did not turn around when I entered the room. "Declan," she said softly, her voice echoing in the empty space. "You came." I stopped 10 feet away from her chair. I did not sit down. "I came to deliver a message," I said. My voice was completely devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a stranger speaking to a ghost. Fiona slowly turned her head. She saw the dark bruising on my jaw. She saw the rigid way I held my posture to protect my cracked ribs. "You survived," she whispered. "I did," I said. "And so did my wife. And so did my children." Fiona looked down at her hands, which were resting limply in her lap. For the first time in my entire life, I saw genuine, crushing regret in her eyes. But it was too late. The damage she had done was irreversible. The 5 years of agony she had caused could never be undone. "You will live comfortably here," I told her, my tone entirely clinical. "Your medical needs will be met. Your staff will be paid. But you are a ghost, Fiona. You will never see Boston again. You will never sit at the head of the table again." I paused, letting the absolute finality of my words sink into the quiet room. "And you will never see your grandchildren," I said. Fiona flinched as if I had struck her. "You will never know their names. You will never hear their voices. You will sit in this beautiful, empty house until you truly understand the horror of what you did." Fiona closed her eyes. A single tear escaped and tracked slowly down her wrinkled cheek. "They are my blood," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They were your blood." I corrected her, turning toward the door. "Now, they are only mine." I walked out of the conservatory. I walked out of the estate. I left her in total, suffocating isolation, surrounded by the freezing mountains. 6 weeks later, the brutal Boston winter had finally broken, giving way to the fragile, pale sunlight of early spring. I stood in the kitchen of Maeve's new house. It was not a syndicate fortress. It was not a windowless concrete vault. It was a sprawling, sunlit home in a quiet, heavily guarded suburb. The walls were painted in warm colors. The windows were large and let in the bright morning light. The chaotic, beautiful noise of a Saturday morning filled the air. Bridget was standing on a chair by the kitchen island, loudly demanding that Rowan hand over the blue cereal bowl. Rowan was clutching the bowl tightly to his chest, his faded security blanket draped over his shoulder, refusing to yield to his sister's demands. Callum was sitting quietly at the table, eating his toast, watching his siblings with his unnervingly observant gray eyes. I leaned against the counter, holding a warm ceramic mug of black coffee. I was wearing a simple gray sweater and dark jeans. The heavy matte black pistol was locked away in a biometric safe upstairs. I was not the apex predator of the East Coast Syndicate right now. I was just a man drinking coffee in his kitchen. Maeve walked up beside me. She was wearing a soft white robe, her auburn hair tied up in a messy knot. She bumped her shoulder gently against mine. "They are going to break that bowl," she murmured, taking a sip from her own mug. "I will buy 100 more," I said quietly. Maeve smiled. It was a real, genuine smile. The hyper-vigilant terror that had haunted her eyes for 5 years was slowly beginning to fade. The trauma was not magically erased. We both carried the deep, invisible scars of the void. We both still woke up in the middle of the night, reaching for each other in the dark to make sure this was real. But we were choosing to build a future. We were choosing the light over the shadows. "Dad," a small voice called out. I turned my head. Callum had slipped down from his chair. He was standing by the back door, holding a pair of small red sneakers. He looked up at me with my exact eyes. "I cannot tie the laces," he said. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. I walked across the sunlit kitchen. I knelt down on the hardwood floor, my healing ribs giving a faint, dull ache that reminded me of the price I had paid to be here. I took the small red sneakers from his hands. I helped him slide his feet into them. I pulled the laces tight, my large, scarred hands moving with slow, deliberate gentleness. "Like this," I told him, showing him the loops. "You cross them over, and you pull tight." Callum watched my hands intently. He nodded slowly, committing the movement to memory. I tied the final knot. I patted his knee. He looked up at me, a small, rare smile breaking across his face. He turned and ran out into the backyard, joining his siblings in the morning sun. I stayed kneeling on the floor for a moment. I listened to the sound of their laughter echoing through the open window. I had burned down the underworld. I had exiled my own mother. I had slaughtered men in the dark. I had done it all to earn this single, simple morning. I stood up. I walked back to my wife. I wrapped my arm around her waist, pulling her close against my side. I looked out at my family, and for the first time in my life, the void was completely, permanently gone.